I don't know what time people will be listening to this, but it is July 1st. There are fireworks going off, and I thus cannot read Vampire Jenny right now. I do have one that is a fanfiction of a fanfiction, Under the Breach by Refraction So Frey. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but I love it to death. 10 out of 10. Am recommending it right now. It updates once a month-ish. I am considering, like, going and asking for their permission to read it on this channel. So if you guys want that, I'm gonna do it after I finish Vampire Jenny. Anyway, this diverges from that fanfic around chapter 16-ish, and it's normal Jenny divergence from canon. So anyway, into this story. Like any other story about Jennifer Evelyn Krall, this one began in the midst of what she liked to refer to as the Great Failure of 1986. She referred to it as such due to things completely out of her control that she still considered failures on her part. Eddie died right in front of her. Dustin followed her back into the Upside Down after being warned not to. Vecna won. They couldn't get Eddie's body through the gate in time, and they had to leave him behind, and to her great displeasure, this venture had failed to kill her. She had just gotten Dustin and herself through the gate before she heard 4 chimes. On instinct, she pushed Dustin out of the trailer as quickly as possible, once again lacking any care for her own safety. The ground shook with a great guttural rumble, and she heard the plywood and metal fracturing behind her. She looked Dustin in his tear-streaked face, his eyes still pouring tears, and smiled at him. "Good luck out there," were the last words she said to him before she woke up in bed, notably less injured and not in the Upside Down where she expected to end up. She looked at her calendar for the most recent crossed-off date in the dark, November 6th. 1983. "Well, shit," she muttered to herself, tearing off the covers, turning on her bedside lamp and pulling out her journal. Empty. She hadn't started writing in it yet because she didn't start using it until she played D&D with Eddie and the gang. This time, it would have a new purpose. She opened to the first page and wrote in scrawling text, "Jenny's Guide to Monster Hunting." And not possibly, time travel. None of her friends were stupid, thorough, or tactless enough to pull a prank like this, and she was very careful with her calendar. There was no possible way it could be 2 years, 4 months, and 23 days off. Time travel would be the most outlandish thing she had experienced, but not unexpected given the nature of the Upside Down. Right. Her monster manual. She got to work filling out each entry to the best of her ability. Dates, times, locations, how many monsters and of what type, who was involved, injuries/deaths, and how, if at all, the situation could hopefully be avoided entirely. Jenny was determined to make sure that there was not a single detail missing. She would not be caught unprepared, especially considering the fact that her goal was to keep her friends out of trouble as much as possible. She couldn't keep everyone entirely separate from the alternate dimension of evil. Will was taken earlier that evening if his personal account was anything to go by, and 11 would be discovered by the boys tomorrow night. She considered stepping in and bringing the girl to her house to keep the boys safe, but decided against it. The boys could handle it on their own. Then it came time for her to find a different notebook entirely to speculate about her conundrum. She found the perfect vessel in a small handheld notepad that could easily be slipped into a hiding place, like behind the drawer of her bedside table. "All right, Jenny, you wake up in the past in your 13-year-old body with all the memories of the future. Nothing blew up or collapsed when you changed future events, so you should be fine. What now?" The question of how didn't need to be asked because she already had a perfectly serviceable theory and no way or intention of trying it out. "Come on, Jenny, you faced down monsters, Russians, and alternate dimensions. You can handle some deja vu." On a whim, she wrote down all the current events-related things she could remember for the next month or so. Eddie's set list for Battle of the Bands, the assembly for Will that the boys would sneak out of, the upcoming science test, Barbara's disappearance, anything she could remember. It was going to be a long week. Her long week began with something she didn't expect after an uneventful day at school. being cornered by a frantic, shorter, and slightly less imposing Jason Carver, insisting she knew something. He was vague and clearly thought something of some sort of prank, but it wasn't entirely clear. I'm only reacting to this calmly because I believe in diplomacy before violence. Please, get out of my face. Calm down, and then, in coherent English, ask me your question, strange, screechy teen, she said sarcastically. She really wished it was literally anyone else approaching her like this. She really disliked Jason for his involvement in the town believing Eddie was a murderer, but at this point, it was best to play dumb. She watched as Jason walked a few paces away, took a deep breath, and approached her again. You're the only person I could think of that could possibly know what was happening to me. That Satanist did something to me. I'm going to cut you off there. I have no idea who this Satanist is, or what they did to you, but that is none of my business. I don't know you, and quite frankly, I don't want to, based on your behavior. I have homework to do when I get home, and you probably are in some kind of sport. Go to practice, and learn not to accost middle schoolers with your delusions. Jenny found it absolutely hilarious that Jason got caught in the rifts and traveled back, but had none of the knowledge about what happened or why. He was just kind of stranded. It shouldn't have been funny. He didn't do anything to deserve feeling like 2.5 years of his life were made up, but she found it funny anyway, and if he went nuts, it was not her problem. What was her problem was when Dustin came home late that night, soaked in rain and fumbling with his house key while shivering on his doorstep. She sighed and pulled on a raincoat. She remembered this. "Do you need help with that?" Jenny asked, seemingly appearing behind him. Dustin nodded, and she opened his front door and ushered him inside. He didn't talk, and she didn't try to make him. "This is about Will, isn't it?" It wasn't a question. "Look, I won't make you talk about it. But I assure you, someone is going to find him. I can't say they'll find him alive, or that he'll be okay, because I don't want to lie to you. I'll be next door no matter what happens, if you need to talk. I made you some hot cocoa, and I expect you to go to bed once you finish it, and get changed." Dustin nodded and took the warm mug in his hands. Jenny left minutes later and watched until she saw his bedroom light turn on and then turn off again. Maybe this time she could find Will sooner. Things happened the same way they did before the next couple of days. Jenny went to school, kept a low profile, continued theorizing about the whole time travel thing in her free time. Things changed the day after Will's body was found. Jenny followed the boys into the AV club room and heard a lot of things. Most concerningly, gunshots, a demogorgon, and Eddie's voice. The fire alarm went off before she could do anything about it, and she followed the crowd out of the building. Okay, think. They had to be at Will's house, or else his mom wouldn't be able to hear him. Barb was with him, and so was Eddie. They got through a gate. That was why the voices cut off. She needed an excuse to go to the Byers' house. She finished out the school day and went directly home. She had some things she needed to grab and homework she needed to get done first before she got involved in other dimensions again. First, she retrieved her notebook on time travel and her monster guidebook. Next, she retrieved some monster fighting essentials, several lighters, cans of hairspray, and as much alcohol and scrap fabric as she could find. She loaded up all of it into an old backpack she used to learn how to hand sew. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold up. She found the denim jacket she wore to the great failure, but elected not to traumatize Eddie further to test a hypothesis. By Jenny's estimate, Eddie had been down there nearly a week. She could only imagine what damage it did to his lungs on top of his stupid decision to smoke. It took several hours before an excuse for her to show up to the Byers' house fell into her lap, rather, showed up on her neighbor's doorstep. "Dustin isn't home and his mom is working," Jenny called out her bedroom window at the teens on Henderson's front porch. "Is Mike there?" The girl, Nancy Wheeler, probably, asked. "No, but I saw the boys go off into the woods after the fire drill. The only thing that in that direction is the quarry and Will's house, so check around there," she said, trying to direct them in the right direction without giving away the fact that she knew exactly where the boys were. Thanks for the tip. If you see my brother, can you call my mom? She's been really worried. Sure thing. I'm Jenny, by the way. Thanks, Jenny, Steve called. She knew that stupid hair anywhere. And he always seemed to remind her of the reasons she would never have a husband. Men were stupid, and women were objectively better looking, in Jenny's humble opinion. As the two peeled off into the night, Jenny realized that the Demogorgon would be killing a man tonight in that general vicinity. She quelled the urge to cuss and snatched her keys as she flew out the door, only barely throwing on a jacket on her way to the car. She sighed and turned the car on. Traffic laws, prepare to be ignored, she mumbled to herself, as she turned her headlights to not spook Nancy and Steve. The cops liked her enough that they wouldn't write her up unless Chief Hopper pulled her over, and he was usually not on duty at this time of night. She heard a loud human scream ahead and took a deep breath. Maybe she wouldn't have to see the monster tonight. She heard a car start speeding through the woods. Well, there goes that idea. She continued and could see the Demogorgon tearing into the corpse of a man as she drove past with a shudder. It took all her willpower not to remember Eddie's bloody face when he was shredded by bats. The key was to not linger on the mental image. She followed the spooked teens to Will's house and parked a bit further away because they were shaken enough as is. Once they were both on the doorstep and Steve was scanning the woods, Jenny got out of the car, carefully shutting the door as quietly as possible and still making Steve jump in alarm. Steve, contrary to popular belief, I am not a 9-foot-tall man-eating creature that heralds from another realm. You can relax. That thing usually takes its time after it catches its prey, she stated dryly, pausing where she was in the yard to pull out a can of hairspray and a lighter. But it's never bad to be prepared. The bat is inspired and surprisingly effective. You do much more damage with blunt force than with ballistics. Steve glared at her and raised the bat as if ready to strike her with it. How would you know that? He growled, ignoring Nancy's conversation with her brother. Because, for better or for worse, I'm your local monster expert. Those things are essentially bulletproof unless you hit them in the petals while their mouth is open. Like I said, you do more damage with blunt force than with ballistics. It's also very weak to fire, she commented, tucking the lighter into her jacket pocket and flipping the can of hairspray into her non-dominant hand. Steve just stared at her, stunned, until he noticed the chatter from inside the house. The door opened to reveal Barbara Holland, a bit worse for wear, but alive. Just beyond the threshold, she opened her arms and engulfed the now crying Nancy in a hug. Jenny called from the yard. Dustin, your mom wanted you home several hours ago. I can tell you about the monsters in alternate dimensions tomorrow when it's not past your bedtime. Dustin poked his head out the window and stuck his tongue out at her, and she sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. Look, I know you're very concerned about Will being alive and the signs of the interdimensional portal he came through, but you have school tomorrow, and I will leave without you if you don't wake up in the morning. Dustin narrowed his eyes at her before asking her, How did you know about the portal? You and your buddies were not subtle about sneaking into the AV club room, and then I used my knowledge on the subject at hand based on the fact that I could hear Will and the monster he was shooting at. Also, I'm secretly a time traveler from a little less than 2.5 years into the future, so I know what the air from the other dimension looks like. As Jenny talked, she gained more and more rapt attention from the people inside and outside the house, namely Eddie, who was slowly making his way towards the door before finally squeezing past the girls and Harrington to tackle her. She laughed good-naturedly and mimed mussing his hair. There you are, you self-sacrificial moron. I'd say I'm disappointed, but I'm more proud of you for saving 2 people's lives in a dimension you learned about 2 weeks ago. Jennifer Evelyn Kroll, I have never been so happy to be called a moron. Being the monster expert is as exhausting and terrifying, he said, doing the same miming of tussling her hair with tears in his eyes. She was here. His Jenny was here, and calling him a moron for doing something incredibly stupid, and not actually ruffling his hair because she knew he normally disliked that kind of thing. Barbara and Will were great, and he loved them to death. But it was so comforting to have someone who knew everything and had been through all of it. Someone who actually knew what they were doing, fighting creatures of the Upside Down. It was then he realized he was sobbing uncontrollably. Ew, Edward, don't use my full name. That's gross. But your egregious sin aside, you did it. You made it out of there with everyone alive, and you're not alone anymore. I'm here now, and you don't have to lead them alone. Do you need more hug time? Eddie didn't trust his voice not to betray him, so he just nodded and kept crying into her shoulder. It was nice. He didn't have to be a hero. He could be a complete amateur fish out of water he actually was. Jenny, on the other hand, was trying to comfort Eddie while scanning the reactions of the onlookers to see who knew she was telling the truth about the time travel. Will obviously knew. She had the feeling Barbara was in on it, despite her attention being fully on Nancy. The girl she could only assume was 11 based on context also had a sort of confused yet knowing look on her face. She could handle 4. The boys clearly thought time travel was a joke, or that she was lying. She could deal with that too. And this is the longest video I've ever made, but like, there's more to this, and I'm just really happy with it, and I really love this fanfiction. Again, I recommend you all read it. Or I will eventually read it. Anyway, good afternoon, good morning, good night, whatever time it is for you. Have a good time. Peace.